There's a specific kind of political statement that is designed not to inform the public, but to manage it. A statement carefully worded to create one impression in a press conference room, while the opposite action is being executed in a military operations center on the other side of the world. And on March 20th, 2026, the United States government produced one of the most transparent examples of that kind of statement in modern American political history. The U.S. president hinted at winding down the Iran war. That was the headline. That was the phrase picked up by Al Jazeera, carried by the newswires, repeated across every major news platform on the planet. The U.S. president hints at winding down. And for approximately 12 hours, that phrase did exactly what it was designed to do. It created the impression of momentum toward an exit. It softened the political pressure from the 85% of Americans who, according to analysts cited in prior reporting, did not support this war. It gave Republican senators who have been privately panicking something to point to when constituents called their offices. Then the Pentagon quietly requested $200 billion in additional war funding. According to an AP source reported on March 19, 2026, the Defense Department submitted a supplemental budget request of $200 billion to continue financing Operation Epic Fury. $200 billion for a war that was supposed to last 4 weeks. That number did not appear in the same headline as the wind down hint. It did not appear in the same news cycle. It was buried, as these things always are, in the paragraph that comes after the paragraph most people stop reading. This is the gap that this video is going to close. The gap between what was said and what was done, between the public statement and the military reality, between winding down and $200 billion. Let us start with what winding down actually looks like when governments mean it. When the United States wound down its presence in Afghanistan, troop numbers fell. When it wound down in Iraq after 2011, bases closed. When any military power genuinely de-escalates the physical footprint contracts, fewer ships, fewer aircraft, fewer boots on ground, smaller logistics chains, reduced procurement requests, those are the measurable signals of an exit in progress. Now look at what the physical footprint of Operation Epic Fury looks like on March 21st, 2026. According to CENTCOM's own public releases and imagery, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, transited the Suez Canal on March 5th and entered the Central Command area of responsibility. The USS Abraham Lincoln, a Nimitz-class carrier, has been conducting active flight operations in support of the operation since at least March 2nd. 2 carrier strike groups, each one representing a floating airbase with dozens of aircraft, thousands of sailors, and destroyer escorts armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles that cost approximately $2 million per launch. That is the physical baseline before the wind down hint was issued. After the hint, according to AP reporting, the Pentagon sought $200 billion more. Not $200 million, not $2 billion, $200 billion. To put that number in context, the entire U.S. defense budget for a standard fiscal year runs approximately $850 billion. A supplemental request of $200 billion for a single regional operation that has been running for less than 1 month represents roughly 1/4 of the annual defense budget being requested as an add-on. That is not the financial signature of a wind down. That is the financial signature of a long war being funded for an extended run. The New York Times reported on March 20th that U.S. warplanes and attack helicopters were actively striking Iranian targets in an effort to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile wide waterway through which, on normal days, roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass every 24 hours. On this day, on the same day that the U.S. president hinted at winding down, American military aircraft were conducting strike missions against Iranian positions guarding the most strategically important maritime choke point on Earth. Winding down is not a phrase that describes kinetic air operations against a defended strait. Bloomberg reported that Brent crude oil briefly touched $190 per barrel before pulling back, with global stocks sinking simultaneously. The European Central Bank held rates steady while explicitly warning of the Iran war's economic costs. Germany was weighing a windfall tax as fuel prices surged domestically. The ECB, the institution that manages monetary policy for 20 European nations, representing more than 440 million people, named the Iran war as the primary uncertainty factor in its rate decision. Central banks do not name ongoing military operations in their policy statements when those operations are winding down. They name them when they calculate the operations will continue long enough to reshape economic conditions for months or years. Consider what the Pentagon funding request tells us about the internal planning timeline that does not appear in any press conference. When a government submits a supplemental budget request of $200 billion, that request does not represent spending for the next 2 weeks. Budget requests of that scale reflect planning horizons of months at minimum. The procurement cycles, the logistics contracts, the ammunition replenishment orders, the fuel agreements, the contractor staffing plans that would be funded by $200 billion are not designed for a conflict that ends before the paperwork is processed. Someone inside the Pentagon, on or before March 19, 2026, constructed a financial plan for a war that continues long enough to require $200 billion in resources that were not included in any existing budget. That plan and the wean-down hint were produced by the same government on the same day. Reuters reported that Iranian strikes damaged approximately 17% of Qatar's LNG production capacity, with the damage expected to last between 3 and 5 years. 3 to 5 years. That is the infrastructure timeline Reuters is reporting from the energy side of this conflict. Qatar's Ras Laffan facility, which accounts for roughly 1/5 of global LNG supply, sustained damage that energy engineers assessed would require 3 to 5 years to fully restore. Iranian drone and missile strikes do not disappear from the supply chain the moment a ceasefire is announced. The physical damage to pipelines, liquefaction trains, and processing equipment persists regardless of political developments. Europe is already feeling this. Bloomberg reported that weeks of war were reshaping the global gas market for years to come, not days, not months, years. Now add the war powers resolution dimension. According to AP reporting, the U.S. president submitted a war powers resolution notification to Congress on approximately March 2nd, 2026. Under the War Powers Act of 1973, that notification started a 60-day clock. Congress must either authorize the use of force or the president must withdraw forces within 60 days of notification. That clock runs to approximately May 1st, 2026. The New York Times reported on March 21st that Republican lawmakers were resisting any public accounting on Iran, worried that hearings would expose internal divisions. Nearly 3 weeks into an unpopular conflict, the party that controls both chambers of Congress had not called a single administration official to testify about war planning, war costs, or war duration. The phrase winding down was therefore doing specific political work in a specific political environment. Republican senators facing the 60-day clock, Republican senators watching approval numbers, Republican senators whose constituents are paying $8.30 per gallon at gas stations in Los Angeles, as the New York Times reported this week. Republican senators who voted for every priority of the U.S. president in the first 14 months of his second term and are now being asked by their own voters why a 4-week operation has produced a $200 billion supplemental funding request with no end date attached. Bloomberg also reported that Defense Secretary Hegseth explicitly stated the Iran war was not becoming a forever war or a quagmire. That statement appeared on the same day that the CENTCOM public releases showed B-52H Stratofortress bombers taking off in active support of the operation. B-52s, long-range strategic bombers designed for sustained, extended air campaigns, not the aircraft profile of a conflict ending next week. And here is the economic dimension that connects every family watching this video to a war they had no vote on. AP reported that Brent crude briefly topped $119 per barrel. The New York Times published a detailed analysis concluding that while the overall U.S. economy has proved resilient to high oil prices, American households have not. The distinction matters enormously. GDP numbers can absorb an oil shock through various mechanisms involving trade balances, corporate margins, and financial sector adjustments. Individual family budgets cannot. The family in Ohio paying $120 to fill their tank does not benefit from a GDP adjustment. The family in Texas, whose grocery bill has increased because fertilizer costs have spiked, because natural gas prices have surged, because Qatar's LNG is partially offline, does not experience macroeconomic resilience. They experience the price of bread going up. Bloomberg's reporting on the Hormuz fertilizer crisis was explicit on this mechanism. Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz was directly disrupting the supply of natural gas used to produce ammonia, the primary ingredient in nitrogen fertilizer. Bloomberg cited the fertilizer crisis as another dimension of economic pressure flowing from the war, rice farmers in South Korea, paddy fields in India where a farmer is photographed sprinkling fertilizer whose price has been driven up by a conflict thousands of miles away. The supply chain between a Qatari gas molecule and a South Asian rice farmer is not a metaphor. It is a documented economic reality that Reuters, Bloomberg, and AP have all now independently confirmed is operating in real time. Al Jazeera reported on March 21st that the war had entered its 22nd day. The live tracker confirmed preliminary casualty figures of up over 144 dead in Iran, at least 18 in Israel, 13 U.S. soldiers, and 21 killed in Gulf states. 43 dead outside Iranian territory in countries that did not declare war, did not vote for war, and in several cases did not even receive adequate congressional consultation before the operation began, as Democratic Senator Chris Coons stated in congressional proceedings cited in earlier reporting. 13 American service members dead. The AP reported the U.S. President attending the dignified transfer at Dover Air Force Base on March the 18th for the 6 crew members of the KC-135 refueling aircraft that went down over Iraq. A KC-135, a tanker aircraft. The kind of aircraft that connects distant air bases to distant targets. The kind of infrastructure that cannot be described as winding down when it is still flying active missions and losing crews. Here is what the gap between the statement and the reality means practically. Every government that has ever needed to sustain domestic support for an extended military operation has used the language of eventual conclusion. The language of phases, of progress, of things being on track toward an end that is always described as near and always recedes as the calendar advances. The phrase winding down is not a factual description of military posture. It is a political tool for managing the domestic political cost of a war, while the military continues to execute its operational planning independent of the press cycle. The evidence from every credible source available this week tells a consistent story. CENTCOM is expanding strike operations. The Pentagon is requesting $200 billion in additional funding. 2 carrier strike groups remain deployed. B-52s are taking off daily. LNG damage will take 3 to 5 years to repair. Brent crude hit 119s. The ECB named the war in its rate decision. German households are facing fuel surcharges. Asian nations from India to Japan to South Korea are scrambling to conserve energy, as AP reported on March 19th. The war powers clock is running toward May 1st with no congressional authorization in sight. Winding down is the caption. The picture underneath it shows something else entirely. The question that every analyst, every allied government, every energy market, and every ordinary family paying a utility bill is now asking is not whether the war is winding down. The evidence answers that question. The question they are asking is this: at what point does the gap between the official description and the operational reality become impossible to maintain? At what point does $200 billion in supplemental funding, reported by AP, become impossible to describe as a brief operation? At what point do gas prices at $8 per gallon, reported by the New York Times, become impossible to present as a temporary inconvenience? At what point does a 22-day war with 1,144 dead, tracked by Al Jazeera, become impossible to frame as a 4-week clean operation on schedule? History has a consistent answer to that question. The gap collapses when the cost becomes personal, specific, and undeniable. When the name on the casket at Dover is from your congressional district, when the gas station receipt is in your wallet, when the grocery bill is your family's grocery bill, that collapse has not yet happened at the scale that forces a political reckoning. But the financial architecture now being put in place, $200 billion, 3 to 5 years of LNG damage, global energy markets repriced for an extended disruption, suggests that the people managing this war from inside the building are not planning for a wind down. They are planning for a long run. And they said, winding down. Share this video right now to everyone in your contact list. The U.S. President hinted at winding down on the same day the Pentagon submitted a $200 billion supplemental funding request, as reported by AP. CENTCOM has 2 carrier strike groups deployed. U.S. warplanes are actively striking Hormuz targets, as confirmed by the New York Times. Qatar's LNG damage will take 3 to 5 years to repair, per Reuters. Brent crude hit $119 per barrel per AP. The ECB named the war in its rate decision, per Bloomberg. The war powers clock runs to May 1st. The gap between what was said and what is happening is documented, sourced, and in every credible news outlet on Earth this week. The question is whether the people watching the press conference, the people watching the military deployment, are being told the same story. They are not.